Uh, yeah, hi everyone. Nice to have this opportunity to speak to you all today. As Rick said, my name's Tris Allinson. I work for BirdLife International, based in Cambridge in the UK, where it's currently quite early in the morning. So if I'm not entirely coherent, that's my excuse. I'd like to have this opportunity to talk about the impact of the expansion of renewable energy, particularly wind energy in Asia on shorebirds, and the role that better spatial planning using what we call avian sensitivity mapping techniques, the role that plays in addressing the problem. So, as you will be aware, wind energy is growing rapidly across Asia. Asia is now the biggest producer of wind energy, and this expansion is anticipated to grow. Not only is the sort of climate change imperative and the need to transition to renewable forms of energy, particularly post-pandemic, many governments are considering renewable energy as a big way to have green recovery. So we're anticipating continuous rapid expansion of wind in Asia. And in the region, a lot of this development is targeted at coastal locations. So those include putting sites on the sort of intersection of natural habitat and modified lands along sea walls, putting turbine arrays in the intertidal and also arrays on the near subtidal. And there's a range of impacts that this can have on shorebirds. The sort of most obvious problem associated with wind turbines is collision. Collision is probably, it's fair to say, less of a significant issue for shorebirds than for other taxa. Things like birds of prey and other large soaring birds are known to be particularly susceptible to collision. And shorebirds are likely to be far less so, although it's understudied, and it's difficult to ascertain the impact of infrequent but catastrophic events. So although under normal conditions, good weather conditions, shorebirds may be able to avoid collision with turbine blades, on those rare occasions with very poor visibility, there's what is the potential for catastrophic collision events. One of the reasons why collision is thought not to be such a big problem for shorebirds is that they have good avoidance mechanisms, but sort of an extension of avoidance is then displacement, where certainly for a lot of seabirds associated with offshore wind, things like divers and sea ducks, we know that they will actively avoid areas of ocean that have turbines in them. For some geese and ducks, this is similar. So there can be problems of birds being displaced from landscapes with turbines in them, or then presenting a barrier to dispersal and migration. There's also issues of disturbance during construction and during operation, both human activity, the noise of the turbines, electromagnetic radiation, and particularly with coastal turbines with illumination. And then far less kind of studied, but I think probably actually more significant are some of the physical changes. So particularly, turbines on the seabed, these are likely to change ocean dynamics, sediment transport, water and sediment quality, which will have knock-on ecological changes to benthic food webs, which will affect whole communities. So there's likely to be some big impacts associated with having wind farms on coastal locations for shorebirds, and at a global level, poorly sited renewable energy infrastructure is a big problem. So Joe Kaiseka and his colleagues at the Nature Conservancy have estimated that if we simply put wind and solar resources where wind and solar facilities where you maximize the resource, i.e. wind farms where it's windiest, solar facilities where solar radiation is greatest, then this could jeopardize over 11 million hectares of natural lands globally, including over 3 million hectares of key biodiversity area, and impact the ranges of 1,500 globally threatened species. And indeed, that loss of natural habitat could release almost 415 million tons of stored carbon, and so seriously undermining the climate benefits of renewables. And intertidal habitats, provide many ecosystem services, including the sequestration and storage of carbon. So there's a lot of good reasons to try and avoid putting wind developments on intertidal locations. And there's a lot of scope to do this. One of the good advantages of wind, and indeed solar, are these are widespread, ubiquitous resources, where much of the Earth's surface has suitably wind, and those areas that don't typically have suitable solar. So, and these industries can be radically integrated into landscapes of low ecological value. You can very easily integrate wind turbines into agricultural landscapes and industrial landscapes, so that with careful strategic planning, it should be possible to meet the region's renewable energy targets without having to use all of the intertidal zone and impacting shorebirds and other wildlife. And in order to achieve this, renewable energy sector needs to work with conservationists to ensure that we're considering those biodiversity impacts early in the planning process. So part of the issue at the moment is that environmental considerations are only considered at a site level. So once a site has already been earmarked, this is when there might be screening of that site and environmental impact assessment. What we really need to do is move upstream in the planning process and look at a landscape scale and identify where are those areas that are problematic, such as intertidal zones, and also identify those areas which are going to be suitable for wind and solar, and target our development there. So I don't know how much of a sort of universal a reference this is, but I often describe the current system as a bit like sort of the game battleships. People may be familiar with battleships, where the aim is to guess where your opponent has their ships and blow them up. And that's largely how the sort of ad hoc planning of wind infrastructure goes. So that people sort of say, oh, well, let's have a wind farm at D5. They decide that is okay through an impact assessment, and they build there. So then they think, let's have a wind farm at D6. That proves to be problematic. So they think, what about F4? But that's problematic. Then they look at H8, that's okay. So H9, but that's not okay. And then, so really this sort of ad hoc approach isn't effective, and also doesn't tell you whether you're choosing, you can through impact assessments assess whether a site has impacts, but not how it relates to other sites. And it'd be far better to sort of effectively cheat at battleships, to be able to look at your opponent's thing and see where are those areas that are going to be sensitive for birds, where are those areas that are going to be fine, and ensure that our wind development is targeted at those. And that's what we try to do through avian sensitivity mapping. So the first sensitivity maps were developed by BirdLife's partner in the UK, the RSPB, for Scotland, and they use data on the distribution of at-risk species to identify those areas across the country that were likely to have a risk to birds of wind development. And this was used as a blueprint by the government there in the subsequent installation of its wind sector, so that you can see that those areas that were identified as being of lower risk in Scotland have largely been those areas where wind farms have been concentrated subsequently. So this is seen as sort of a model of how to go about planning in a coherent way a wind sector. So BirdLife has since then become sort of a world authority on developing maps, and we of this nature. We work with people all around the world in the energy sector to ensure that there is this good planning behind wind and solar. So across for soaring birds across the Mediterranean, Middle East and Northeast Asia, we've developed a soaring bird sensitivity mapping tool, which enables people to quickly assess the potential sensitivity to wind developments in advance of construction. We've just finished working with the European Commission on producing a manual of best practice guidance for member states of the European Union on how to go about doing sensitivity mapping, and the European Commission is now advocates that countries undertake this kind of strategic sensitivity mapping ahead of any renewable development. We work directly with governments, so we've worked recently, funded by Power Africa, with the Kenyan government to identify the areas sensitive for birds and bats to wind development, and look at those areas that are particularly sensitive in relation to wind, and be able to identify which areas are suitable for wind, but also have low sensitivity in terms of birds and bat species. And we work directly with governments. I've done a lot of work with the Japanese government and with the help of our partner there, the Wild Bird Society of Japan, to enable the government there to develop its own sensitivity maps for on and offshore wind. And what I wanted to finish by talking about today was our latest piece of work, where we are we have just started a project funded by the Asian Development Bank, where we're looking to develop a online tool that can be used across Asia and then hopefully globally, to provide early indication of the avian sensitivity for planning the energy sector. So the tool will provide an assessment of sensitivity in relation to wind energy, both on and offshore, also photovoltaic, solar, and overhead power lines. And what we have here is kind of just we're the start of this work. We hope 2 years from now to have this tool ready. So what we see here is just a sort of crude mock-up of what we intend to create for the tool. But the general idea is that, starting with a few emerging key markets in Asia, but hopefully expanding it across Asia and indeed across the world, to be able to kind of look at a country such as India, zoom in on a region within that country, and then get an assessment of the sensitivity for birds in relation to different energy sectors. So in relation to wind, to solar, and to power lines, and to a combination of those. So for example, for wind, you will be able to look and then see what is the sensitivity at quite a fine granular level across that area. And we achieve this because we have a good understanding now about those species that are most susceptible to renewable energy development, the morphological features that make them more susceptible, the life history traits that make them more susceptible. And we have developed a range of algorithms that take account of these things, as well as things like the conservation status and lots of other factors. And by collating information on these at-risk species, we can map where the most sensitive areas are. What we also intend to do is also map where the most suitable areas are resource-wise for these different technologies. So you'll be able to look, for example, for wind at just those areas where wind is commercially viable, and see the sensitivity of those areas, and you'll be able to interrogate particular areas, find out about an area, what its sensitivity is, what species are there that make it sensitive, the sites that make it sensitive, what its wind suitability is. So this site has moderate wind suitability, but very high risk of impact on avian communities. So that would be one you would hope to avoid, whereas a site such as this has high suitability for wind, but low potential for risk to birds. So hopefully a site like that would be preference. And as I say, we're just beginning to roll out that tool, but we're hoping that it will be a tool that will become a kind of global tool, particularly in the first instance expanding through Asia. And ADB, although funding in the first instance, are keen for it to be developed with any kind of audience in mind. So we're keen to look, anyone who has any interest in bringing the tool into different regions around the world, different countries, we'd be interested in working with them, and happy to answer any questions now, but also if people want to get in touch with me about any issues around renewable energy expansion in the region, these are my details. Thank you.